Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right in to deconstruct the rhetoric surrounding the recent US-China summit in Beijing. Specifically, we're unpacking how a highly opinionated TV broadcast framed the whole event. We'll peel back the layers of some seriously intense rhetoric, look at the core arguments, and see exactly how modern political narratives are built, completely neutrally without taking any sides ourselves. Let's get to it.
The broadcast wastes absolutely no time hooking its audience. It immediately sets up an adversary, and surprisingly, it's not actually China right out of the gate, it's the mainstream media. By zeroing in on dire media predictions, like this, quote, anticipating China's final victory lap over the US, the host creates this massive dramatic contrast. It perfectly sets the stage to position the current administration as the underdog defying the odds, while painting the media as a chorus of doubters just waiting to be proven wrong. And listen to how the host juxtaposes these opposing views. On one hand, you have the media's expectation, an America bogged down by Middle Eastern conflicts, limping to the negotiation table from a place of weakness. But then, the host aggressively flips the script. They dismiss these critics as completely unserious, insisting that actually, the US holds the absolute upper hand here. It's a classic rhetorical pivot, right? Framing the critic's skepticism not just as wrong, but as fundamentally naive. Which brings us to our first main section, tariffs as a weapon, the core mechanism. Now, in an Econ 101 class, tariffs are just taxes on imported goods, but the broadcast totally redefines them here. They aren't treating tariffs as some dry, bureaucratic policy. No, they're framed as a huge power move. They're calling it the ultimate America First leverage. The host really emphasizes that this weapon was deployed despite massive pushback from Wall Street. That paints this vivid picture of a singular leader using brute economic force when the financial establishment was supposedly just too timid to pull the trigger. And to really seal the deal, the broadcast uses the president's own words. The quote here argues that the only way you're going to get along with China is by dealing from a position of strength, specifically because of tariffs. It tells the viewer that traditional diplomacy, or soft power, that's out the window. Diplomatic success, according to this narrative, comes exclusively through unilateral economic pressure. Moving on to part 2, decades of trade imbalance, the historical grievance. So how does the broadcast justify this aggressive stance? By building a very specific historical timeline. The argument goes that over the last 20 years, America essentially financed its own greatest rival's rise. It starts 2 decades ago, with the US actively helping build China into a powerhouse. Then the initial shift hits. China starts flooding the market with basic stuff like textiles and shoes. Fast forward to today, and China is dominating high-tech sectors, from electronics to drones. The narrative draws a straight, unbending line from American complacency straight to Chinese dominance. And the host places the blame for this directly on 4 specific American failures. They argue the Chinese Communist Party fully capitalized on weak US trade policy, corporations basically being incentivized to outsource millions of jobs, the massive theft of critical intellectual property, and a Washington establishment that was completely distracted by wars in the Middle East. It's a heavy-hitting list, clearly designed to evoke a sense of betrayal, driving home this idea that Washington was asleep at the wheel while a superpower rival was built using American resources. All right, Section 3, Results of the Summit, Promises versus Reality. So, with all this intense buildup about economic weapons and strength, you'd expect some explosive results, right? Well, the actual deliverables described by the broadcast are surprisingly bureaucratic. The summit is portrayed mainly as a friendly stabilization effort. Instead of immediate, massive economic victories, we're talking about discussions to form a bilateral board of trade and plans for a board of investment in non-sensitive areas. It's a pretty fascinating rhetorical downshift, going straight from the language of economic warfare into the language of handshakes and committees. But to their credit, the host actually drops the hyperbole for a second to look at the hard data, admitting that the devil is in the follow-through. Just listen to these numbers. While 500 Boeing jets were expected, only 200 were actually secured. 600 beef export licenses were promised, but 400 are just sitting in limbo. It really highlights a distinct gap between the projected strength of the administration going into the summit and the on-the-ground reality of what was actually negotiated. Even with those underwhelming numbers staring them in the face, the host absolutely refuses to concede any loss of power. They double down on their core thesis. America still has the ultimate leverage. Why? Because, as the segment bluntly puts it, we don't need them as much as they need us. The argument is that China is fundamentally an export economy, relying on selling to the US. So, in their view, that structural economic reliance absolutely trumps any short-term delays in a trade deal.
And to really hammer home this idea of American dominance, the host points straight to the stock market. They contrast the 19,000 Dow Jones average back at the previous election with the massive 50,000 milestone today. It's using a domestic financial metric as a direct proxy for geopolitical winning. The message is pretty clear. Look at the insane wealth being generated right here at home, and you'll know exactly who's winning the global standoff.
Now, so far, this narrative has been all about strength and victory. But any truly persuasive argument has to anticipate its counterpoints, right? So does this broadcast actually pause its victory lap to acknowledge any strategic risks or flaws in the administration's approach?
Surprisingly, yes. And it reveals some real internal tension. The host briefly breaks from the praise to voice some severe personal concerns. They openly criticize the president for praising Xi Jinping, bluntly calling the Chinese leader a murderous dictator who unleashed COVID. On top of that, they raise major national security alarms about companies like NVIDIA selling advanced AI chips to Chinese firms. It's a move that shows the audience the host isn't just a blind cheerleader. They have their own very strict ideological boundaries.
Which brings us to our final section, the domestic political clash, Republicans versus Democrats.
The broadcast then pivots away from global diplomacy and straight onto the domestic battlefield. Using a quote from a critic, they highlight a very real political danger for the current administration, the fear of a chips for beans deal. The anxiety here is that the U.S. might sacrifice long-term technological supremacy, like licensing out advanced AI chips, just to secure some short-term agricultural purchases that look good on paper. The host frankly admits that if America comes out of this summit looking vulnerable or out-negotiated, the party in power is going to pay a massive price at the ballot box.
But the absolute second a vulnerability is exposed, the host goes right back on the offensive. They use aggressive rhetorical questions to deflect criticism back at the opposing party. By asking what a Democrat president has ever done more than Trump to stand up for U.S. manufacturers, the segment effectively neutralizes attacks on their own trade record. It immediately frames the political opposition as historically weak on this exact issue.
And this is exactly where the rhetoric reaches its absolute hyperpartisan peak. The broadcast hits its viewers with a stark ultimatum. On one side, the current administration is praised as the real opportunity to grind China down. On the flip side, a hypothetical Kamala Harris presidency is described in literal apocalyptic terms as a nonstop celebration of the end of America. It's textbook polarization. They're ensuring that even if a viewer is completely disappointed with the summit's actual results, the alternative is framed as so catastrophic that it's just unthinkable.
Finally, the segment wraps up its core argument with a completely dismissive jab at China's displays of power, saying, let them put on all their parades. The host projects absolute, unshakable confidence in American endurance. The parting message is one of totally inevitable victory, that despite the messy negotiations and internal party concerns, time is ultimately on our side, not theirs. As we finish up today's explainer, we really have to take a step back and ask ourselves a critical question. When we absorb complex foreign policy through these highly charged, polarized narratives, where tariffs are literally called weapons, political opponents are viewed as apocalyptic, and every diplomatic summit is framed as a battle for survival, how does that actually shape our ability to objectively evaluate global events? Hopefully, by deconstructing this rhetoric today, you're walking away with a sharper eye for how information is spun, helping you focus on the actual substance. Keep questioning the narrative, and we'll see you next time.